So, without further ado, Ari Berman, thanks for joining us. National voting rights correspondent at Mother Jones, author of several books. My favorite is Minority Rule, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Ari, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Max, great to see you. Thank you.
So let's get right into it. Your book is really expansive. I like it because it touches on a lot of recent history, anywhere from the 80s to the early 2000s to the early 2010s, but it also goes much further back. Um, so far back, it goes to the first presidential election. And, you talked about how uh, in that first presidential election, only 6% of Americans, male white landowners, could vote. Um, we see echoes of this history later on from Pat Buchanan in the 90s when he was warning about, the browning of America to the Tea Party, right? In 2010, 2011, arguing that, only property owners should vote. Um, and so what strikes me is like today, these ideas seem like fully embodied in MAGA and in the Republican Party. And so my question is, what do you see in this? What does this tell us about their ultimate view of American democracy?
Well, that's a really good question. I think there's always been this fundamental tension throughout American history of these lofty words in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and then the reality that our political system was structured to prevent many people from participating. And that was by design. And there's just been kind of this long arc in American history of trying to bring new people into the political process. First, it was white men who didn't own property, and then it was black men after the Civil War, and then it was women, and then ultimately with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the US really became a multiracial democracy for the first time. But there's always been people that have been threatened by that effort to try to make democracy more inclusive. And you're seeing that really today. You're seeing a lot of people who are afraid that the country's white majority will one day become a white minority, that the country is changing demographically, that we are on a verge of becoming a majority minority country, that lots of states like Texas and Georgia have already gone down that path or are close to it.
Yeah,
And
just recently,
basically,
Georgia.
yeah. And so, I mean, recently there's been a lot of efforts to try to push back on that, whether it's through gerrymandering or voter suppression or things like the Supreme Court destroying the Voting Rights Act. And really, you have with Trump this very reactionary effort to essentially change the mechanisms of voting to very explicitly help Trump and his party. I mean, he's said it, the quiet part out loud so many different times that they have to do this or they feel like they're going to lose. And so they've made voter suppression, gerrymandering, all of those things very explicit. And I think that they talk about it in terms of political terms because that's ultimately what they care about on the short term level. But I think the longer term level, what they're trying to do is prevent the changing demographics of the country from having an influence and trying to build this fortress to stop what they see as the coming siege.
I think you're spot on, and that opens the door for so many more of my questions. But one quick aside that I hadn't planned to talk to you about today, but we're talking about demographics and how people are counted. It strikes me, Trump's first term, they tried to mess with the census,
Hmm.
and you cover that. You get very sort of in the weeds on who was doing it and sort of how ridiculous it was. I think one of the operatives Trump placed inside the department conducting the census was like a YouTuber who was known for pranks and had famously like drank his own urine or something. But his name's Joey Salads. Yeah. But yeah, so talk me through that a little bit because we're seeing echoes of that now. There is talk of changing the census. Trump's talked about it. Marjorie Taylor Greene, when she was still around, talked about it. Even Steve Bannon has talked about the importance of this.
So, one of the major themes I think we see from Trump, both in his first term and then even more explicitly in the second term, is this desire to weaponize these core constitutional functions from being things that benefit everybody to being things that only benefit Trump and his party. We've seen him try to do it
Mm,
with the post office, for example. Instead of just delivering
yeah.
the mail, they want to weaponize it so that you don't get your mail ballot anymore, for example. And so we're seeing that across the board, but I think they very explicitly tried to do this with the census in 2020 because I mean, the census is the basis for representation and a whole lot more. I mean, it's really how we distribute so much of political and economic power, right? And so
Isn't it
you
like
can change.
roads, schools?
Exactly. I mean,
hospitals.
it's like the basis for allocating everything, not just
Mm.
representation, but like all those other things as well. And essentially, if you can change the numbers, right, then everything gets changed as a result of that. And so their idea was, let's quite literally try to make the census in the country more white and count fewer immigrants than before, because the census says that you should count everyone in
All
America,
people.
whether
Yes.
all people, whether documented or undocumented. They really didn't like that. They tried to change it. They didn't succeed, but they've obviously tried to achieve this through other means, right? They've tried to do really draconian immigration restrictions to make the country explicitly more white. They've done things like take white refugees from South Africa, but not refugees from countries that are far more dire. But those refugees would look different, for example. What they've done in terms of the gerrymandering. I mean, it's very explicitly about protecting white power, ousting black members of Congress, particularly in the wake of the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act. So I think like what they did with the census was a preview in many
Mhm.
ways of what has really been like the underlying goal of Trump's second term, which is like, how can I try to manipulate every single aspect of government instead of helping everybody to just helping me and my party? And he's succeeded in some of it, he's failed in some of it, but that's no doubt the like overall operating of the overall kind of manual for how he sees government, broadly speaking.
Yeah, it's an operating principle. It's a system of levers to exercise his power on us. Who, I think it's clear he views us as subjects that he rules. Not people that he's accountable to, and he wants to be less and less accountable to us. But you know, uh, what we're talking about now, sort of these long term plans. I think a lot of people view Trump as just kind of like a chaos force of chaos, right? So it's hard to think of him like actually thinking long term and planning and things like that. So that makes me think of like the Heritage Foundation, sort of these like, elite conservative uh, minds that do make long term plans, and that's a fascinating dynamic that you touch on in your book. And one point specifically that I found really interesting and telling was how these sort of elite conservative circles harnessed grassroots anger. You talked about how the Heritage Foundation specifically created the book Heritage Action to intentionally link themselves to the Tea Party movement and sort of, push these aggressive voting laws. And then, a parallel to that, we've seen Leonard Leo's Federalist Society just kind of like raising money and being present in law schools all across the country to eventually sort of like take over the machinery there. So, is this something you track? Like, how have you seen these groups weaponizing undemocratic institutions, whether it be the Senate or the Supreme Court, to sort of engineer that system that allows for minority rule?
Well, I think that a lot of the things that these groups want to do is unpopular. So the question is,
Mm.
in a democratic system, how do you do things that are unpopular? And the way that you do it is you co-opt those democratic institutions, which may not be that democratic in the first place, right? And so, I mean, you look at Leonard Leo, like he has basically made the Supreme Court the way that he portrays all it gets through like all the
Yeah,
things that they've wanted to do through the Federalist Society. And I mean, the Supreme Court is inherently a product of two undemocratic institutions, which is how we elect presidents and how we elect senators, right? Because how we elect the president is fundamentally unconstitutional because you can win the popular vote and lose the electoral college. So right there, it
which we've seen
violates,
recently a lot.
yeah, which you've seen recently, and it's a problem that's becoming worse. So that just violates basic notions of one person, one vote. The U.S. Senate is fundamentally undemocratic because each state gets two senators regardless of population, which means that small, rural, overwhelmingly white states get far more representation than larger, more diverse, more urban states. That problem is also becoming worse. And then the Supreme Court is based on those two institutions. Then, of course, it's been engineered explicitly to be more undemocratic with how Trump did his nominations, right? First, going back to blocking Merrick Garland, and then the way they
Mm.
pushed through Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, all in questionable ways. And then, of course, the court is not just a product of these undemocratic institutions, but it's made America less democratic by doing things that are radically unpopular, like overturning Roe v. Wade, by doing things that fundamentally distort our democracy, whether it's the destruction of the Voting Rights Act or Citizens United or so many other things they've done. So it's like this anti-democratic feedback loop that the institutions are inherently flawed, but the decisions that these institutions make are make that those institutions even more flawed, and then that's what the right is
Like
targeting.
a
And
snowball almost.
yeah, and so, like,
Yeah.
they're thinking, like, "Let's try to do this all so that it's immune from popular mobilization or it's immune from any kind of public backlash." Now, this is gonna be really interesting because the Supreme Court's doing a lot of things that are very unpopular right now and that are leading towards a public backlash, and you could argue that there was a lot of mobilization as a result of Dobbs, and I think you're gonna see a lot of you've already seen it, but I think you're gonna see, um, significant mobilization in the wake of the destruction of the Voting Rights Act. I saw one poll recently of Black voters, and they said they viewed the Supreme Court as the biggest threat to American democracy, even bigger
Yeah.
than Trump. And of course,
I
those two
mean,
things are related. But
after
that's
South
pretty shocking.
Carolina's
Yeah.
after South Carolina special session, we just saw like massive turnout in their primaries. I think it speaks to exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, even in, Georgia, where you live, I mean, the fact that Republicans didn't redistrict even when they could have in
Mm,
a GOP-dominated legislature with a Republican governor showed the political realities that they didn't do it because they thought it would be bad policy. They were afraid of the politics of it. And so,
100%.
to me, like, still, I think that the real thing is that, like, some kind of mobilization really matters in response to these things. Like, it's easy to sort of feel helpless and powerless and feel like there's these big structural forces that are rigging everything. And I think to some extent that's true. I write about that
I I would agree.
very, very extensively. But it's also true that, like, things can change based on how people react to them. And I
100%.
think that's kind of what we're seeing right now.
Your Georgia example, special session is spot on. You know, myself, our Fair Fight team, we were there. About 500 people came out. It was a collective effort of Fair Fight, of Black Voters Matter, of a bunch of other groups here in Georgia. And when the Republican politicians saw that, even before the special session technically started, they announced that they weren't going to move forward. So, I think it's really important to get involved. It'll make you feel less isolated, make you feel less concerned about these like forces rigging, and it reminds us that we have power, right? That's sort of the point of this democracy, that we have the power to make changes. But you were talking a little bit about like how money plays a role in all this, and so I want to look into another part of your book. You look at Wisconsin as sort of like a case study of what happens when big money meets minority rule. And so after Citizens United, which you just mentioned that decision, billionaires like the Koch brothers were really on the forefront of flooding these state legislatures and these state like PACs and maybe federal level PACs with millions, to sort of enact policies to loosen regulations, to bust unions. And then at the same time, even back then, Republicans were manufacturing myths about voter fraud. And in Wisconsin, specifically in Milwaukee, you wrote about, which I thought was wild. And Republican elected officials and law enforcement officials investigated those claims back then and found nothing, by the way. So um, that's a long way to ask, how did that era in Wisconsin sort of serve as a blueprint for what we're seeing now?
One of the things that I've written about a lot is how what's happening at the federal level now really started at the state level. And I think
Mhm.
Wisconsin was critical because it had been regarded previously for a long time as a laboratory for democracy, as a state that had a lot of good things happen, whether it was giving rise to the blueprint for things like Social Security or unemployment insurance. And Republicans saw that and they're like, how can we change it? How can we change it from a laboratory for democracy to a laboratory essentially for destroying democracy? And so they did all
For
these things.
oligarchy. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. After Republicans took control after the 2010 election, and this was not exclusive to Wisconsin, but Wisconsin was a good case study of it. They did things like really gut the power of labor unions, gut campaign finance laws, pass new voter suppression laws, stack the courts with partisan appointees, things like that. And the idea was like have a model that works for a powerful few as
Mm.
opposed to the common good, the broader majority. And I think that's so instructive because that's really the path that Trump took and that MAGA took. And what I argue is that it was the radicalization against democracy by the Republican Party that gave rise to Trump in the first place. And if the Republican Party hadn't already radicalized against democracy, they would not have been looking for a Trump-like figure, right? A dictatorial figure to essentially lead their party. And so Trump
Authoritarianism.
dramatic
Yeah.
yeah, Trump dramatically worsened that problem. But I think it's worth noting that it was these attempts at the state level, it was these attempts to try to undercut democracy that Trump seized on and then went much further. But so many of these battles are still playing out at the state level, and that's one of the things that I think is really important about the midterms is that there's nearly 100 statewide races for things like governor and secretary of state and state attorney general. These races are so important because Trump can talk all he wants about things he wants to do with regards to voting on a federal level. His power is actually very limited, but
Constitution's
most
pretty
things,
clear.
most things are going to happen at the state level. And that's where the local elected officials matter. And those races are getting a fraction of the attention of a Trump speech. They're not even getting as much attention as the statewide races or the House races for Congress. And so I would just urge people to keep paying attention to those races. I think they're really, really important. And pretty much every swing state this cycle has has these elections. And who's elected in 2026 will determine who's in control of the electoral process in 2028, which is super important.
100%. And speaking of just opportunities here in Georgia, there is a real opportunity for the state house to flip blue. 10 seats need to flip. There's a bunch of counties that were very close in the 2024 election, and just given the overperformance that we've seen in 2025 special elections and in some primary elections here and some specials this year, it's very possible. In 2018, Georgia Democrats flipped 11 state house seats, and this year they need 10. Since 2018, every election, they've essentially gained one or two more seats. They haven't lost any. So it's been a slow climb, but it's very possible. And it underscores kind of your point there about the importance of state legislatures, because even if, Democrats here in Georgia can't take back the state Senate this year, they could potentially win the governor's office, maybe, maybe not. But as long as they have, one sort of foothold in power, they can obstruct unfair maps. They have a sort of voice in the process, so to speak.
Yeah, and these state legislatures are so important. I mean, they really are the most powerful offices that people don't really ever think about. And there's so few votes that determine who a local state legislature is compared to votes for a House member or a senator or a president. And whenever I ask where can you get the most bang for your buck, I always urge people to focus on the state legislature because it's that combination of being extremely powerful but constantly overlooked, and where votes and
Yeah.
organizing really does matter. And especially because a lot of people don't even know who their state legislature is. They might be really animated by things they're doing, right? Banning abortion or gerrymandering and making it harder to vote, but people still might not even know who's my member of the state
Yeah.
legislature, right? What are they doing? And so those people are often kind of faceless. And so I think that's critically important. I would just urge people to sort of pay attention to all of those races. And yeah, a lot of those state legislatures are up, and we could see some pretty dramatic changes. And obviously, those legislatures are also really important because they're the ones who are going to draw the voting maps. If they haven't drawn them already,
Yeah.
in the wake of the mid-decade redistricting, they're going to draw them in 27 and 28. If we have more mid-decade redistricting, or certainly by after 2030 when this process is supposed to take place.
Yeah, and hopefully the census will be, okay and done correctly. But I want to touch on one point that you made a couple of minutes ago, sort of like the early Wisconsin blueprint for this radicalization, as you called it, in terms of against democracy. I really feel like we're almost at a new level of that now. So, like, if you look post 2020 election, look here in Georgia, we saw essentially the most aggressive attempt in modern history to throw out the results of a free and fair election. After that call where Trump said, find me the votes. Operatives, like his attorney at the time, Cleta Mitchell, have sort of moved this strategy into an infrastructure. And this one is the Election Integrity Network. They have state chapters, they have sort of a national framework. They present themselves as grassroots, but they're really a very professionalized and well funded operation that is specifically trying to not only attack the infrastructure of elections and how they run, changing rules, changing laws, but also sow doubt, right? They were one of the main spreaders of these election myths that Trump loves to talk about. So, my question is like, what does this tell us about how the far right strategy has evolved? It feels like they're now more concerned with sabotaging actual machinery of elections than competing and trying to win votes.
Yeah, well, they have moved from simply trying to do voter suppression, which matters, but tends to matter more on the margins,
Mm,
to just outright trying to throw out votes altogether, which is the most ultimate voter suppression tactic because Trump was saying, just find me the X number of votes I need to overturn the election. I mean, that's the most undemocratic thing you can do. And I think what we learned from 2020 is that elections are only over when the results are certified. And that is a
yes.
long process. And so that means that there is a fight now over how to vote. We are still very much seeing those things. How votes are counted. We are very much seeing that. And how elections are certified. And that's where all the things at the local level really matter. Who is on county board of elections? Who's on the state board of election? We've seen some very bad MAGA people take over the state board of election in places like Georgia. Who the election officials are that are going to certify and oversee that process. That all really, really matters. And I think that's that stuff that people really need to pay attention to because I think that people are understandably very concerned about what Trump is going to try to do to the voting system, but he doesn't have the power to really unilaterally do anything. But what he's going to do, and he did this in 2020, and we can very much expect him to do this again in 2026, he's going to lean on people at the local
Mhm.
level. And so it's really important to try
That's
to
his whole mob boss
hold those
play, you
people.
know?
Yeah, hold those people accountable, right? And one of the things the election deniers have been very good at is taking over these board of elections, taking over these
Yeah.
state election boards, going to all of these meetings and stuff like that. And there has to be people on the other side doing that too. And I know you guys are trying to do all of that work. But I think it's really important for people to, as if you sort of care about like what Trump is saying, and if you're worried about what he's trying to do, I would be paying attention to who's at the local level and be talking to them right now to make sure that make sure they're prepared to certify the election and count votes no matter who wins. Because there's going to be a lot of pressure bearing down on some of those people come November if it hasn't started already.
100%. And we've heard Democrats in Congress talk and other organizations like Democracy Forward talking about running tabletop exercises and planning and talking to these local officials, making sure they do have plans, that they do know their rights, that they do have some idea of what to do if some kind of federal interference materializes. So that's really encouraging. And this all can feel bleak at times. um, and so I want to respect your time. I want to just close out with one final question here, which is, how did researching all this for the book, the deep history, the more recent history around minority rule, prepare you for this moment? And what keeps you hopeful when you're doing this work? Because these are heavy things.
Well, just recognizing that what we're seeing play out today has played out before in American history, that, as I
Mhm.
said earlier, there's been this really long struggle between those that want to narrow democracy and those that want to expand democracy. And in many ways, we are seeing a new iteration of that fight today. And I think the thing that makes me hopeful is usually, with some very notable exceptions, the US has taken the path of expanding democracy. We've expanded the right to vote historically. We've allowed, through many, many battles, more people to participate in the democratic process. And we're in one of those battles today where there are people that are dead set on trying to restrict political participation, but there's also people that are fighting back. And so I think we're really at one of those like pendulum swinging moments, and
Yeah.
sort of it's certainly swung in Trump's second term one direction, right? In terms of what the president has done, what the Congress has attempted to do, and what the Supreme Court has done. Certainly, that doesn't mean it can't swing back. And so, I think what I've also learned is that while you have to be focused on short-term victories, and those are often play out in terms of elections, you also have to be focused on long-term institutional reform. And so that to me is is really what I see what's happening right now. That to me is what I'm focused on beyond just the midterms is how do we reform these fundamentally broken systems from how we elect presidents to how we elect senators to I think most importantly how we choose Supreme Court justices. And I think that's a conversation that needs to happen, and it needs to happen sooner rather than later, because I don't just want to elect different kind of people to essentially inhabit a broken system. I want to ultimately try to change that system itself.
Well said. And your point about like, the country has historically expanded democracy. It has, but it's been more of an up and down slope going upward. It's not a straight line, right? And
Yeah,
it really does rely on our participation. What's that famous John Lewis quote? Democracy is it's a participatory sport, essentially. So we all got to get involved, check your voter registrations, spread the word. If you can, go to a local election board meeting, make sure things and the people that are doing the things in your local area are being held accountable. Um,
for sure.
yeah. Well, I think we could leave it there. Again, Ari, thanks so much for your time. I highly encourage everyone to go check out Minority Rule, become my favorite book. Really useful in this moment, especially. Thanks so much,
Thanks,
Ari.
man. Really appreciate it. Always nice to see people holding physical copies of things these days.
I've got audiobook, ebook, and physical.
Yeah, man, I need to get you something. That's the trifecta right there.
Oh, yeah. Thanks,
Okay,
Ari.
thanks, Max. Great to see you. Thank you,
And
everyone.
thanks to everyone who joined. Appreciate it.